you are listening to Just Films, and this is the podcast where we celebrate films we think deserve a little bit more love. Just me this week, so we're going to be tackling another listener's suggestion. If you'd like to suggest a film for us to take a look at, then drop us an email to filmsandthatpod@gmail.com. Tell us your suggestion for a film you think deserves more love, and tell us a little bit about yourself. Think 30-second game show intro. Whilst I've got your attention, if you could head on over to whatever app or website, whatever it is you listen to this on, and give us a little 5-star rating and review. It helps other people find us, and hopefully they'll get in touch with their listeners' suggestions as well. You can also, if you would like, use your rating and review to suggest a film for us to cover, and we will make sure those take priority because, you know, you're helping us out by giving us a lovely review. You can even do it with a voice note if you want, and that's just what listener Chris had to say. So let's hear what he had to say. Sorry about this, it's on my phone. I'm going to have to play it off my phone. 1 second.
Hi, this is Chris from Bedford, and I am talking to you about one of my film obsessions, which is The 13th Warrior. For me, this is a criminally underseen film, mainly because of its slightly strange story of remnant Neanderthals terrorising a Norse kingdom in the Dark Ages as a sort of inspiration for Beowulf. It's got everything in it for me. It's got Antonio Banderas pretending to be an Arab. It's got quite a few British and Irish thespians chewing the scenery as Viking warriors, and lots of Neanderthals running around in bearskins. Thank you.
So there we go. Thank you very much for getting in touch with us, Chris. So as Chris said there, it is criminally underseen in his eyes. So let's take a look at it then. If you haven't seen it, little summary of the plot. The 13th Warrior is about a film about Antonio Banderas plays a disgraced Arab poet named Ahmad Abin Fadlan. Hope I've said that right. Apologies to anyone. I have not pronounced that very well. He's exiled from Baghdad. He finds himself unexpectedly joining a band of Viking warriors when a prophecy calls for 13 warriors to defeat a fearsome cannibalistic tribe called the Wendel. Ahmad, the 13th warrior, must overcome cultural differences and prove his worth to the Norsemen, ultimately facing the Wendel in a series of intense battles. Yeah, so they've got 12 warriors. They need a 13th. There's a prophecy, and he says he'll do it. You know, this, that, and the other. It's actually directed by John McTiernan, who, if you listen to this, you may well already know, but he directed Die Hard, Predator, Last Action Hero, loads and loads of other films. And it's also based on a Michael Crichton book, and Michael Crichton was heavily involved in the making of this film. I think he even taken over it at one point as well. So let's get stuck in then. I'll start with the positive, what I liked about the film, move on to the negatives, and then we'll take a look at the critical reception, decide, is it underrated? Is it underseen based on box office? And obviously Chris has said the reason he's picked it because he thinks it's criminally underseen. I had heard of this, but I'd only really heard of it in the context of it being quite a famous flop. I knew Antonio Banderas was in it. I had absolutely no idea it was based on Michael Crichton property, who did Jurassic Park, if you didn't already know, along with other films like Congo, which we've done. And it's directed by John McTiernan, who I've already touched on there. So all I knew about this was going into it was a famous flop in terms of it cost loads of money and didn't make loads of money back. Had no idea how it did critically or anything like that. Often, you know, poor scores and poor box office in examples such as this can go hand in hand. That doesn't necessarily mean that they always do. Touching on what I like then, I have a first play to like here. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I'll touch on it a little bit more later, but I did think it started slowly and built up in the second half, but loads to like in there. So largely, the film looks pretty good. There's a real strong visual style based on this idea of different cultures clashing. So you've got Antonio Banderas' character who's from Baghdad, and you've got the Vikings, as Chris said in his note, it's a precursor to Beowulf, so the Wendel, which in the story of Beowulf is sort of like a monster or a cannibalistic tribe in this and things like that. So loads of different cultures and sort of clashing, but in a way that it works really well as a visual style and things like that. Work really well together to create a world in terms of the world of the film and things like that. Some great cam work in there, some good effects too. So it did have that old school sense of adventure. Whilst it's not as good as things like Indiana Jones, The Mummy, Mask of Zorro, I can see what it's going for, and it is in that ballpark. It's not as good as them, but it's sort of, it's aiming for them, particularly like your Indiana Jones and you know, like a touch like a Lawrence of Arabia and things like that. The action's pretty good in this too. There's some decent set pieces, some decent sword fights, some good touch of gore as well, if that's your thing. nice little mix of generic signifiers as well. So there's action in there, like I've touched on, but there's little bits of horror in there as well. There's some quite interesting storytelling devices in this as well. So in the way that, like, one that I really liked was they show Antonio Banderas' character, who's obviously from Baghdad, can't speak their language, and the Vikings can't speak his language. And it shows him learning their language by observing them speaking in their native tongue, and then it switches into English, and that's signifying that he's learned, not that they've just decided to speak in English, but that he's actually learned what they're saying. And I thought that worked really well. I thought that was a really interesting device. Again, loads of interesting ideas in terms of how different cultures and backgrounds can help each other, and there's definitely like a diversity to it and stuff, which I really enjoyed. Felt quite progressive for 1999, considering issues with films that are well documented at the time. Cast are good as well. There's a lot of good camaraderie between them. There's a lot of the guy from The Thing. There's a lot of people that you recognize and stuff like that. Antonio Banderas is really great, and this is too. He sort of plays considering he's off the back, not long off the back of Assassins and Zorro in this. He does a good job of playing quite a non-conventional hero. I can't think of many other mainstream Hollywood films where the main character is a banished Muslim writer, poet, ambassador. So I think that's quite an interesting thing. And there are some issues with the fact that Antonio Banderas is cast, which I'll sort of touch on again in dislikes. But I think obviously he's not from the right background, and I'm not from that background either. But looking at it as objectively as I can, I think I can see what they're going for. I can see what they're trying to do in terms of representation. In the same way, what popped into my head was like Morgan Freeman in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, in terms of casting a known actor, getting bums in seats, but also sort of, I think the heart's in the right place, really. I don't think they're trying to, it is based on source material at the end of the day, so that I don't think they're trying to offend anybody, even if the casting is a little bit tone deaf. But on the other hand, like I touched on there, non-conventional hero, he is not he's not an all-action hero. He's a little bit more of a thinker in this, and he does have action scenes and stuff like that. But I do think it was quite an interesting choice of protagonist. Moving on to the dislikes, then it is a little bit narratively messy. Certainly at the start, as I said, it starts slowly and a bit confusingly, and then it sort of settles into itself. The only reason I really knew what was going on at the start is because you have Omar Sharif's character, who's sort of exposition dumping and just explaining everything as he goes along. And once Antonio Banderas goes off in his adventure, you do really feel his absence, and I found some bits of the plot hard to follow, which meant I found it hard to sort of form attachments to characters like the Beowulf inspiration character, and some of the emotional beats because of that didn't land for me. So I do think it needed a touch more depth of character, touch more depth of story. But I also get, on the other hand, Antonio Banderas' character in this is very much like a narrator, and you're sort of figuring stuff out as he goes along as well. So I do get that. It does settle into itself into the second half, though, and then after that, it falls foul of certain Hollywood tropes, like a completely pointless love scene, which I'd imagine might actually offend people, depending on how bothered some people are about levels of accuracy and things like that. Other than that, I've already touched on that. As Chris said, Antonio Banderas does play a character from Baghdad in this, so it's not great. It's a little bit tone deaf, but I do understand it's a bit of a bygone era type thing, and it's sort of balanced out by, I think their heart was in the right place, whilst also balancing that reality of film stars get films made and get films budgeted and bums on seats and things like that. Critical reception then. So just to remind you of how we do it, we look at the IMDb, the Rotten Tomatoes audience and critics, and we average those out, and we'll decide if we think that is underrated. And then we'll have a little look at the box office as well. So Chris picked this because it's underseen. He's not really mentioned the rating, but we'll look at them anyway. So at the time of recording, over on IMDb, it gets 6.6 out of 10. Over on Rotten Tomatoes, the audience give it exactly the same. They give it 66%. And then the critics on Rotten Tomatoes, quite harshly, I think, give it 33%, which averages out at 55% or 5.5 out of 10. I would say that's slightly underrated. It is flawed, but I think there's a perfectly decent action film in there. And I think if we say the critics' score is usually the swaying factor, I think 33% is fairly harsh. I think I'd be more in line personally with the IMDb and that audience score of 6.6, maybe slightly lower. Box office wise, then, so Box Office Mojo says this grossed just over $61 million worldwide. I've seen mixed reports on the budget, because obviously a box office flop normally has to be compared to its budget and things like that, as to if it is actually a flop and things like that. So I've seen mixed reports with some people saying the budget is nowhere near as high as it's reported. So it's hard to work that out, but I think based on the fact that it's quite often considered a box office flop, we can probably say it is underseen. And then I think that's supported then when you consider the fact that it's from the director of Die Hard, the writer of Jurassic Park, and the star of Mask of Zorro. So I think that probably is based on that budget there. I think it's definitely underseen. Look, overall, I think there's a half decent action adventure film in here. It's not one I'll be absolutely chomping in the bit to go back to, but whilst I was reading about the film, there's loads of love online for it. There's loads of people who say that they love it. Chris obviously likes it and thinks it's underseen, and I'd be inclined to agree that it definitely is underseen, and I think definitely there's an audience for this film. So hopefully, Chris, that's the sort of result that you were looking for, and thank you very much for writing in. We'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us and suggest a film, it's filmsandthatpod@gmail.com. We're on all the social medias as well. So if you search for Just Films and That on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, you'll find us. Give us a follow. We're always putting stuff out there, and do feel free to suggest some films for a listener suggestion episode. Thank you as ever for listening. I really appreciate it. It's goodbye from me. I'll see you next week. Goodbye. Cheerio.